I want to welcome y'all. Say shalom, Shabbat shalom. Welcome to Y'all Only Tanakh study. Today, got a special treat for y'all. It's a couple of odd occurrences in the New Testament. It's going to be a quick study. I want y'all to lay back. Let's look at the magicians, or the Magi, where they came from and why. The Magi in the Bible came from the east, which is in Matthew 2:1. The east at the time of JC's birth meant Media, Persia, Assyria, and Babylonia, countries now encompassed by Iran and Iraq. And these are images of the Magi, what they would have looked like back then. Matthew 2:1-3, 7-10. After JC was born in Bethlehem in the territory of Judea during the rule of King Herod, Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. They asked, "Where's the newborn king of the Jews? We've seen his star in the east and we come to honor him." When King Herod heard this, he was troubled, and everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him. Now, the Messiah was supposed to deliver everyone from whatever oppression they was under and bring about peace. So, why it says everyone in Jerusalem was troubled with him? That's an odd occurrence. Now, let's go to 9. When they heard the king, they went and looked. The star they had seen in the east went ahead of them until it stood over the place where the child was. So, let's look at this again. Okay. The magicians came from the east to Jerusalem, so they're already in the east. And 2 says they seen his star in the east. So if they came from the east to Jerusalem, which would have been west of them, and they said they seen a star in the east. So that's another odd occurrence. They're already in the east and they see a star in the east. All right, let's move on. Christian tradition. Biblical magician. The word magos, Greek, and its variants appear in both the Old and New Testaments. Ordinarily, this word is translated magician or sorcerer in the sense of illusionist or fortune teller. And this is how it is translated in all of its occurrences, such as Acts 13:6, except for the Gospel of Matthew, where, depending on translations, it is rendered wise man, like the KJV, or left untranslated as Magi, typically with an explanatory note, like the NIV. However, early church fathers such as St. Justin, Origen, Augustine, and Jerome did not make an exception for the gospel and translated the word in its ordinary sense as magician. The gospel describes how magicians from the east were notified of the birth of a king in Judea by the appearance of his star. Upon their arrival in Jerusalem, they visited King Herod to determine the location of the king of the Jews' birthplace. Herod, disturbed, told them that he had not heard of the child, but informed them of a prophecy that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. He then asked the Magi to inform him when they find the child so that he himself may also pay homage to the child. Now let's check into the so-called census in Luke. Luke 2:1-5. In those days, Caesar Augustus declared that everyone throughout the empire should be enrolled in the tax list. This first enrollment occurred when Quirinius governed Syria. Now, keep in mind, 3. Everyone went to their own cities to be enrolled. Since Joseph belonged to David's house and family line, he went up from the city of Nazareth in Galilee to David's city, called Bethlehem in Judea. He went to be enrolled together with Mary, who was promised to him in marriage and who was pregnant. Now, this is an odd occurrence. It says, 3 says, everyone went to their own cities to be enrolled. So, Joseph was already in his own city because he was in Nazareth. So why would he have to go to David's house, David's city in Bethlehem, if it says everyone went to their own cities? And we don't know if Mary was from if Mary was in her own city. Also, it says everyone, so Mary would have had to went to her birth city or her own city, if you believe that. Now let's put the two together and compare them. We got Matthew 2:1-5 and Luke 2:1-4. Matthew says JC was born in Bethlehem in the territory of Judea during the rule of King Herod, and magicians came from the east to Jerusalem. Luke says in those days Caesar Augustus declared that everyone throughout the empire should be enrolled in the tax list. Since Joseph belonged to David's house and family line, he went up from the city of Nazareth in Galilee to David's city called Bethlehem in Judea. Alright, Wikipedia. The census. It's generally believed to be a census of Judea taken by Quirinius, governor of Roman Syria, upon the imposition of direct Roman rule in 6 CE. The Gospel of Luke uses it to date the birth of JC, which the Gospel of Matthew places in the time of Herod the Great, who died between 5 BCE and 1 CE. Luke appears to have conflated Quirinius' census with the death of Herod, and most critical scholars acknowledge a confusion and misdating by Luke. Now this is an odd occurrence, because this is the God-breathed word in the New Testament, right? Gospel of Luke, contrary to the Gospel of Matthew, which places JC's birth in the time of Herod I, the Gospel of Luke correlates Christ's birth with the census. Luke's apparent error has led most biblical scholars to acknowledge that this gospel is incorrect. Luke seems to have incorporated the census to move Joseph and Mary from Nazareth, their own city, to Bethlehem, where the birth was to occur. The author of Matthew had the reverse problem, believing that Joseph, Mary, and JC lived in a house in Bethlehem prior to their flight into Egypt. They moved to Nazareth to avoid the recently appointed Herod. Scholars point out that there was no single census of the entire Roman Empire under Augustus, and the Romans did not directly tax client kingdoms. Further, no Roman census required that people travel from their own homes to those of their ancestors. A census of Judea would have not affected Joseph and his family who lived in Galilee under a different ruler. So this is an odd occurrence. Crucifixions. Will Pilate and the Romans allow JC to be taken down and buried the same day of his? Crucifixion is a method of capital punishment in which the victim is tied or nailed to a large wooden cross or beam and left to hang until eventual exhaustion and asphyxiation. It was used as a punishment by the Persians, Romans, among others. Crucifixion has been used in parts of the world as recently as the 20th century. The process. In Roman-style crucifixion, the condemned could take up to a few days to die, but death was sometimes hastened by human action. The attending Roman guards could leave the site only after the victim had died and were known to precipitate death by means of deliberate fracturing of the tibia, fibula, spear stab wounds into the heart, sharp blows to the front of the chest, or a smoking fire built at the foot of the cross to asphyxiate the victim. The Romans sometimes broke the prisoner's legs to hasten death and usually forbade burial. On the other hand, the person was often deliberately kept alive as long as possible to prolong their suffering and humiliation, as to provide the maximum deterrent effect. Corpses of the crucified were often left on the cross to decompose and be eaten by animals. Scholars differ on the historicity of the burial story and the question if JC received a decent burial. Points of contention are if JC's body was taken off the cross before sunset or left on the cross to decay, if his body was taken off the cross and buried specifically by Joseph or by the Sanhedrin or a group of Jews in general, and if he was entombed, if so, what kind of tomb, or if he was even buried in a common grave. Martin Hengel argued that JC was buried in disgrace as an executed criminal who died a shameful death, a view which is now widely accepted and has become entrenched in scholarly literature. John Crossan argued that JC followers did not know what happened to the body. According to Crossan, Joseph of Arimathea is a total mark creation in name, place, and function, arguing that JC's followers inferred from Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23 that JC was buried by a group of law-abiding Jews as described in Acts 13:29. This story was adapted by Mark, turning the group of Jews into a specific person. What really happened may be deduced from customary Roman practice, which was to leave the body on the stake, denying the honorable or family burial, famously stating that the dogs were waiting. British New Testament scholar Maurice Casey also notes that Jewish criminals were supposed to receive a shameful and dishonorable burial, quoting Josephus. The general situation was sufficient for Josephus to comment on the end of a biblical thief, and after being immediately put to death, he was given at night the dishonorable burial proper to the condemned. This is in Josephus's Antiquities. Somewhat similarly, he says of anyone who has been stoned to death for blaspheming God, let him be hung during the day and let him be buried dishonorably and secretly. New Testament historian Bart Ehrman gives 3 reasons for doubting a decent burial. He notes that sometimes Christian apologists argue that JC had to be taken off the cross before sunset on Friday because the next day was the Sabbath and it was against Jewish law, or at least Jewish sensitivities, to allow a person to remain on the cross during the Sabbath. Unfortunately, historical records suggest just the opposite. Referring to Hengel and Crossan, Erdman argues that crucifixion was meant to torture and humiliate a person as fully as possible, and the body was normally left on the stake to be eaten by animals. Erdman further argues that criminals were usually buried in common graves, and Pilate had no concern for Jewish sensitivities, which makes it unlikely that he would have allowed for JC to be buried. So to add to this, right, I have one more thing to show you. I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna show y'all one more thing. All right, let's look up Pontius Pilate. Let me read this. So Pontius Pilate was a Roman prefect of Judea, or governor. Let's look at the historical and traditional accounts. Okay, protected by Sejanus, Pilate incurred the enmity of Jews in Roman-occupied Palestine by insulting their religious sensibilities, as when he hung worship images of the emperor throughout Jerusalem and had coins bearing Roman religious symbols minted. After Sejanus' fall in 31 CE, Pilate was exposed to sharper criticism from certain Jews who may have capitalized on his vulnerability to obtain a legal death sentence on JC, which that's New Testament rhetoric. The Samaritans reported Pilate to Vitellius, legate of Syria, after he attacked them on Mount Gerizim, 36 CE. He was then ordered back to Rome to stand trial for cruelty and oppression, particularly on the charge that he had executed men without proper trial. He executed men without proper trial. So then when you get into the New Testament, let's see what happened. Now that was the historical. Now this is the Pilate that they portrayed in the New Testament. Judgments of the man himself must be made almost entirely on the basis of later Jewish and Christian writings, chiefly those of Josephus in the New Testament. Josephus's reference appeared to be consistent. They seem to picture a headstrong, strict Roman leader who, although both rational and practical, never knew how far he should go in a given case. He provoked both Jews and Samaritans to riot. let me go down some. The New Testament suggests that Pilate had a weak, facilitating personality. Would the mob just be happy if he released Barnabas instead of JC on the feast day? Right? Pilate is depicted as having accepted the Christian interpretation of the meaning of JC, and he rejects Jewish leaders' reminder that JC has merely said that he is king of the Jews. On the other hand, John's picture of Pilate delivering judgment from a tribunal in front of the governor's mansion fits typical Roman procedure. Clearly, as an index to the character and personality of Pilate, the New Testament is devastating, but it is preoccupied with concerns of the nascent Christian communities, increasingly making their way among the Gentiles and eager to avoid giving offense to Roman authorities. Let me read that again. The New Testament is devastating as an index to the character and personality of Pilate, but it is preoccupied with concerns of Christian communities, increasingly making their way among the Gentiles and eager to avoid giving offense to Roman authorities. All right. That's all I got. Another odd occurrence. All right, so I'm gonna say shalom, and I'll be back with another one. We working. Again, this was a Y'all Only Tanakh study presentation. A couple of odd occurrences. Y'all make sure to check out the TikTok and the YouTube. Y'all Only Tanakh. All right. Shalom.